February 27, 1992, Albuquerque, New Mexico. 79-year-old Stella Liebeck is sitting in the passenger seat of her grandson's 1989 Ford Probe. They've just pulled through a McDonald's drive-thru, and the car is completely stopped in the parking lot. Why? Well, because the 1989 Ford Probe doesn't have cup holders. So she places her 49-cent cup of coffee right between her knees just to free up her hands, trying to pry off that stubborn plastic lid so she can add a little cream and sugar. And the cup tips over. The entire contents pool right into her lap. Now, this coffee was poured at exactly 180 to 190 degrees Fahrenheit, and Stella, she's wearing cotton sweatpants. That fabric acts exactly like a sponge, instantly absorbing that near-boiling liquid and trapping it directly against her skin. Within seconds, literally seconds, Stella sustains third-degree burns over 6% of her body, specifically her inner thighs, buttocks, and groin. Plus, she gets lesser burns over another 16%. If you don't know, third degree is the absolute deepest classification of a burn. We're talking full thickness destruction of the skin, right down through the dermis into the underlying tissue. She's rushed to the hospital where she spends 8 agonizing days undergoing skin grafts and the debridement of dead tissue. She drops 20 pounds. Her doctors actually warn her family that for a woman her age, injuries of this severe depth carry a very real risk of death. She does survive, thankfully, but the aftermath involves 2 years of constant, grueling medical treatment. The exact financial toll? It comes to roughly $10,500 in medical bills, plus another $2,000 for disability and the lost income of her daughter, who had to take significant time off work just to take care of her. So that brings the immediate total to exactly $12,500. Now here's where things get wild. Stella Liebeck didn't immediately call a lawyer and demand millions. She actually just wrote a letter to McDonald's. She simply asked for about $20,000 to cover her actual out-of-pocket expenses and her daughter's lost wages, and she just asked them to please look into the temperature of their coffee. McDonald's wrote back, and they countered with a deeply insulting offer of just $800. That single piece of paper, that $800 offer, that's what ended the negotiation and forced a lawsuit. Once the lawsuit actually began, the legal discovery process unearthed some pretty alarming facts about the physics of these burns. An expert testified that at 180 degrees, human skin suffers third-degree burns in just 2 to 7 seconds. But if that same coffee were served at 155 degrees, it would take roughly 20 seconds to cause a comparable injury. 20 seconds gives a human being time to react, you know? It gives you time to set the cup down or pull soaked clothing away from your skin. 2 to 7 seconds? That guarantees permanent destruction before your brain can even process what's happening. So why on earth was the coffee so dangerously hot? Well, the internal quality control manuals pulled during discovery provided the answer. McDonald's specifically mandated brewing coffee at 195 to 205 degrees and serving it at 180 to 190. Their stated goal? To preserve the preferred taste for commuters during their drive home. This extreme heat was a deliberate, calculated corporate choice, even while other restaurant chains were serving their coffee at a much safer 135 to 160 degrees. But then the lawyers found this number, 700. Between 1982 and 1992, McDonald's had received over 700 prior complaints of burns from their spilled coffee. These range from mild to severe third-degree burns, and several of them actually involved kids and infants who couldn't pull themselves away from the spill. In response to these prior incidents, the corporation had already quietly paid out more than $500,000 in settlements. The defining moment of the trial came from the company's own quality assurance manager. When asked on the stand about those 700 prior complaints, he testified that McDonald's had absolutely no plans to lower its serving temperature. Out of roughly 1 billion cups of coffee sold annually, he stated that 700 severe burns were simply considered, quote, an acceptable injury rate. The company hadn't even bothered to warn consumers because they considered the risk of severe burns to be completely obvious. An incredible paradigm shift happened in that courtroom in August 1994. The jury was made up of 12 ordinary New Mexicans. Post-trial interviews revealed that step 1 was exactly what you'd expect. They walked into the courtroom expecting this to be a completely frivolous lawsuit, and they firmly wanted Stella Liebeck to lose. But then step 2 happened. They saw the clinical, horrifying photographs of her destroyed skin. And then step 3, they heard that corporate manager testify that her injuries were just an acceptable cost of doing business. Those 12 hostile skeptics transformed into a furious jury. So they delivered their verdict. They awarded Stella $200,000 in compensatory damages, but the final payout was actually $160,000. Why? Because the jury actually reduced the initial award by 20%. they held Stella partially responsible for placing the cup between her knees in the first place. You see, the jury was entirely rational and measured about the actual damages. But then came the punitive damages, and this is the number that made global headlines and cemented this case into public lore: $2.7 million. It sounds entirely outrageous, right? The classic example of a runaway jury handing out a lottery ticket to a clumsy driver. Here's the second major surprise. That $2.7 million wasn't just pulled out of thin air. It was a mathematically precise penalty. The jurors calculated it to equal exactly 2 days of McDonald's nationwide coffee revenue. That's it, 2 days. They reasoned that a financial penalty highly visible to the corporation was the only language the executives would actually understand and respond to. Furthermore, Stella never even saw $2.7 million. The judge actually reduced those punitive damages to $480,000. And before the appeals process even finished, both parties quietly settled out of court for an undisclosed amount, which is widely reported to have been less than $600,000. But the facts no longer mattered because the narrative had already been hijacked. Within weeks of the 1994 verdict, the case became a cultural punchline. By 1995, late-night comedians were mocking it, politicians were invoking it on the floor of Congress, Jerry Seinfeld used it as a plot point, and throughout the late 90s, insurance trade groups and corporate lobbying organizations spent millions using the McDonald's coffee case as Exhibit A in a massive tort reform campaign, arguing that ordinary citizens were destroying the economy with absurd lawsuits. They successfully manufactured a public myth that a careless, greedy old woman was driving, spilled coffee on herself, and hit the jackpot in a broken legal system. Just contrast that with the stark truth. She was a passenger in a parked car. She suffered third-degree burns requiring skin grafts. She initially asked only to cover her hospital bills, and the headline-grabbing penalty was an exact, mathematically justified fraction of corporate revenue. Now, despite the aggressive PR campaign that successfully erased the truth from public memory, the lawsuit itself actually worked exactly as the jury intended. It forced fast food companies to permanently change their dangerous practices. Almost immediately, major American chains lowered their service temperatures to a much safer 160 degrees. Warning labels suddenly appeared on every cup, and lids were completely redesigned so they would actually seal reliably. Which brings us back to the woman sitting in the passenger seat of that Ford probe. Stella Liebeck passed away in 2004 at the age of 91. According to her daughter, the lawsuit did not make the family wealthy. Instead, Stella lived out her final years carrying the profound physical scars of the event, her days marked by lingering pain rather than any sort of lottery-style windfall. Her agonizing burns forced a global industry to change its standards, likely saving countless others from the exact same horrifying medical trauma. Yet, the defining cultural legacy of her suffering was a multi-million-dollar corporate campaign designed to make the world laugh at her. The punchline lives on. Meanwhile, the real Stella Liebeck remains exactly where the world left her, sitting in the passenger seat of a parked Ford probe, quietly waiting for the pain to stop.